My name is James Harrington, and I guess you could say I've been running away from my own shadow for a while now. After losing my wife last year, I've struggled to keep things together, especially with my son Peter. He's 17, angry, and blames me for her death. Maybe he's right. Maybe I could have done more. But this trip to Black Hollow Campground was supposed to be our chance to fix things, to reconnect. At least, that's what I told myself when we packed up the old RV and hit the road. The campground was tucked away in a remote valley of the Appalachian Mountains in West Virginia. It was quiet. Too quiet. The air felt heavy, like it was holding its breath. The trees were tall and dense, their branches weaving together so tightly that hardly any sunlight made it through. The place had an eerie beauty, but Peter didn't seem impressed. He barely looked up from his headphones as we pulled into our campsite. "This is it?" he muttered, slumping in the passenger seat. "Yeah," I said, trying to sound upbeat. "It's peaceful, no distractions. No Wi-Fi," he shot back. I ignored him and focused on setting up camp. The RV wasn't much, a 1970s Winnebago Brave that I'd inherited from my father-in-law, but it had everything we needed for a few days in the wilderness. As I worked, Peter wandered off toward the edge of the campsite and started poking around in the dirt. "Hey, Dad," he called out after a while. "Look at this." I walked over and saw him holding a rusty metal tag with faded numbers etched into it. It looked like something a miner might have worn. "Cool find," I said, trying to engage him. Peter shrugged and stuffed it into his pocket. Whatever. That first night in Black Hollow was uneventful at first, just the two of us sitting by the fire in awkward silence. But as we crawled into the RV to sleep, strange things started happening. Around midnight, I woke up to a faint knocking sound coming from underneath the RV. It wasn't loud enough to be alarming, but it was persistent. Tap, 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 like someone knocking on a door. I told myself it was just raccoons or maybe a branch scraping against the undercarriage. Peter didn't even stir. He was out cold in his bunk. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The next morning, Peter looked pale and groggy when he woke up. "You okay?" I asked. He nodded, but didn't say much. As we cleaned up around camp, I noticed coal dust on his bare feet, black smudges that shouldn't have been there since he hadn't left the RV all night. "Where'd you get that?" I asked. Peter frowned and looked down at his feet like he hadn't noticed it before. "I don't know." Things got stranger from there. The campground had an old payphone near the entrance, a relic from before cell phones were everywhere. And when I tried using it to call home, it connected me to some wrong number instead. A woman's voice came through the static, sobbing softly before hanging up. "Probably just a bad connection," I muttered to myself, but my hands were shaking as I put the receiver back. By our second morning at Black Hollow, frost had started forming on the RV windows overnight, intricate patterns that looked almost like antlers stretching across the glass. It didn't make sense. It wasn't cold enough for frost yet, not in early autumn. Peter noticed it too, but didn't say anything. He just stared at the windows like they were spelling out something he couldn't read. Later that day, we met Marlene Wilson, a solo camper staying at a site nearby. She seemed friendly enough and offered us some extra firewood she'd collected. "This place has some history," she said as we chatted by her campfire that evening. "Ever heard of the hunger that walks?" Peter perked up at that. He loved creepy stories, even if he pretended not to care about anything else. "No," I said cautiously. "What's that?" Marlene leaned closer to the firelight, her face half shadowed by flickering flames. "Legend has it that miners trapped underground during a cave-in resorted to cannibalism to survive," she explained. "But one of them, a medicine man, was cursed for what he did and became something unnatural." Peter rolled his eyes but didn't interrupt her story. "They say his spirit still roams these mountains," Marlene continued, lowering her voice as if someone might overhear her. "He feeds on hunger, the kind you feel in your stomach and the kind you feel in your heart." I laughed nervously and changed the subject, but Marlene's words stuck with me long after we returned to our campsite that night. As we settled into bed again, Peter muttered something under his breath before falling asleep. "This place feels wrong." I wanted to argue with him, to tell him he was imagining things, but deep down I knew he was right. The next day started off colder than I expected. The frost on the RV windows was thicker this time, and the air outside felt sharp, like it was cutting through my jacket. Peter didn't say much as we ate breakfast, what little we had left. Our food supplies were disappearing faster than they should have been. I asked him if he'd been sneaking extra snacks, but he swore he hadn't touched anything. Maybe animals got into it. I said, though I didn't really believe that. The RV was locked up tight at night. Peter just shrugged, his eyes darting toward the forest like he was waiting for something to come out of the trees. Later that morning, while gathering firewood, I ran into Roy Delaney. He looked like he'd been living in these mountains his whole life. Grizzled beard, patched up coat, and a face carved with deep lines. He wasn't unfriendly, but there was something about him that made me uneasy. "You shouldn't be here," he said, without any small talk. "Excuse me?" I asked, confused. "This place isn't safe," Roy continued. "Not since the miners dug too deep." I tried to laugh it off. "We're just camping for a few days. We'll be fine." Roy shook his head slowly, his eyes fixed on me like he was trying to warn me about something he couldn't say outright. "Leave before the new moon," he said simply, then turned and walked back into the woods. When I got back to the campsite, Peter was sitting by the fire pit with a strange look on his face. He held up the rusty miner's tag he'd found earlier and pointed to the faint name etched into it, asterisk. "Do you think this guy worked in those mines Marlene was talking about?" Peter asked. "Probably," I said, though my stomach churned at the thought. That night, things got worse. The knocking sounds returned, louder this time, and seemed to come from inside the RV walls instead of underneath it. Peter grabbed my old tape recorder and started recording the noises while I tried to figure out where they were coming from. When we played back the tape later, the knocking had turned into whispers, low voices speaking in a language neither of us could understand. "What is that?" Peter whispered, his face pale. "I don't know," I admitted, my hands trembling as I rewound the tape to listen again. Around midnight, I woke up to find Peter gone from his bunk. Panic surged through me as I scrambled out of bed and threw open the RV door. He was standing at the edge of the campsite, barefoot in the freezing cold, staring toward the abandoned mine entrance in the distance. "Peter," I shouted as I ran toward him. He didn't respond at first, his eyes glazed over like he wasn't really there. When I grabbed his arm and shook him, he blinked and looked at me like he'd just woken up from a dream. "What are you doing out here?" I demanded. "I don't know," he stammered. He just felt like I had to go. I dragged him back inside and locked all the doors and windows. Neither of us slept much after that. The next morning brought an unseasonably cold wind that whipped through Black Hollow like it was trying to push us out of the valley. The RV's heater stopped working entirely, and frost began forming inside the vehicle, on the walls, on our blankets, even on our skin if we stayed still too long. We decided to leave early. Whatever was happening here wasn't worth sticking around for. But when we tried driving out of Black Hollow, we found that the road leading back to civilization had vanished, replaced by dense forest that seemed to have grown overnight. "This isn't possible," I muttered as I stared at the trees blocking our path. Peter didn't say anything. He just gripped his seatbelt tightly and stared straight ahead like he was afraid to look around. As we turned back toward camp, we noticed Marlene's RV sitting eerily silent in its spot. Her boots were lying outside her door, filled with fresh snow despite there being no snowfall anywhere else, and small bones were scattered around them like someone had emptied a bird's nest onto the ground. "Marlene?" Peter called out hesitantly as we approached her RV. No answer came back, not even an echo of his voice. When we peeked inside her RV later that day, we found nothing but empty space and a lingering smell of decay. Whatever had happened to her wasn't something either of us wanted to think about too hard. That evening brought an intense blizzard, the kind you'd expect in January or February, not October, and trapped us at our campsite once again. The snow piled up fast around the RV until it felt like we were buried alive. The scratching noises returned with a vengeance, clawing at every surface of our vehicle until it felt like something was trying to rip its way inside. Peter started acting strange after that, complaining about an unbearable hunger, even though we'd eaten everything left in our supplies earlier that day. His hands shook as he reached for my arm at one point, his eyes wild with desperation. "Peter," I said firmly, pulling away from him. "You're scaring me." "I'm sorry," he whispered hoarsely. "I don't know what's wrong with me." Neither did I, but deep down I knew it had something to do with Black Hollow and whatever curse hung over this place. The blizzard raged on through the night, howling like a living thing outside the RV. The walls creaked under the weight of the snow, and the frost patterns on the windows grew more intricate, long twisting shapes that looked like antlers reaching out toward us. Peter sat by the small table, his head in his hands, while I paced back and forth trying to think of a way out. That's when we heard a knock at the door. It wasn't like the knocking we'd heard before. This was deliberate. 3 slow, heavy taps that sent chills down my spine. Peter and I froze, staring at each other. Who is it?" I called out, my voice shaking. "It's Roy," came the muffled reply. "Let me in." I hesitated. Something about his voice sounded off, like it was layered with static or an echo that didn't belong. But when I glanced at Peter, he nodded toward the door. We needed answers, and Roy was the only person who seemed to know what was happening. I unlocked the door and pulled it open just enough to let him inside. He stumbled in, covered in snow and shivering violently. His face was pale, and his eyes darted around the RV like he expected something to jump out at him. "You shouldn't have stayed," he said through chattering teeth. "I told you to leave." "We tried," I said, frustration bubbling up in my chest. "The road's gone. The forest." "I know." Roy interrupted. "It won't let you go now." "What won't let us go?" Peter asked, his voice sharp with fear. Roy looked at him, then at me. "The Wendigo shaman," he said quietly. "It's been here since my great-grandfather's time, since the miners buried that medicine man alive." Peter pulled out the rusty miner's tag from his pocket and held it up. "Thomas Blackfell," he said. "Was that him?" Roy nodded grimly. "That tag belonged to him. The miners thought they could silence him by burying him in one of their tunnels after he cursed them for stealing sacred land. But they only made things worse." "What does it want?" I asked. My throat dry. "Hunger," Roy said simply. "It feeds on your pain, your guilt, and then it takes everything else." Before we could ask anything more, a loud crash shook the RV. The lights flickered as frost began spreading rapidly across the walls and ceiling. Roy's breath hitched as he turned toward the door. "It's here," he whispered. Before I could react, the door burst open with a deafening roar of wind and snow. Standing there in the storm was something I can barely describe. It was tall, at least 8 feet, and impossibly thin. Its coal-black skin stretched tight over its bones. Its head was a deer skull with massive antlers wrapped in rusted chains and bits of mining equipment. And its eyes glowed green like burning embers in the dark. Peter screamed as Roy stepped forward, raising his arms like he was trying to protect us. "Go," Roy shouted at us over the wind. "Run." The Wendigo shaman didn't hesitate. It reached out with one bony hand and touched Roy's chest. In an instant, his entire body froze solid, ice creeping up his limbs until he shattered into 1,000 pieces right in front of us. "Dad," Peter yelled, grabbing my arm as I stood there frozen in shock. We scrambled back into the RV as the creature stepped inside, its antlers scraping against the ceiling. It didn't move fast. It didn't have to. But every step it took seemed to make the air colder and heavier until it felt like we couldn't breathe. Peter grabbed a kitchen knife from one of the drawers and held it out shakily as I searched desperately for something, anything that could help us fight back. That's when I noticed the frost patterns on the walls again, the same ones that had been appearing every morning since we got here. They weren't just random shapes, they were symbols. "Peter," I shouted over the howling wind, "the miner's tag. Give it to me." He fumbled in his pocket and tossed it to me just as the Wendigo lunged toward him. I don't know what made me do it, maybe desperation, but I pressed the tag against one of the frost symbols on the wall. The reaction was immediate, a blinding flash of green light that made both Peter and me shield our eyes. The Wendigo let out an ear-piercing screech and stumbled back, its glowing eyes dimming for just a moment. "It works," Peter shouted, but our victory was short-lived. The ground beneath us suddenly gave way with a loud crack, and before we knew it, we were falling, tumbling down into darkness as old mining tunnels swallowed us whole. When I came to, I was lying on cold stone in what looked like an underground cavern lit by an eerie green glow coming from veins of coal embedded in the walls. Peter was nowhere in sight. "Peter," I called out, my voice echoing through the tunnels. "Dad." His voice came from somewhere deeper inside, a mix of fear and relief. I stumbled through the twisting tunnels toward him, but they seemed to shift around me like they were alive. Time felt strange down there. Minutes stretched into hours as I fought against exhaustion and panic. Finally, I found him in a cavernous space filled with partially preserved bodies, the miners who had been trapped down here over a century ago. And standing among them was the Wendigo shaman, holding Peter by his arm as if deciding what to do with him. "Let him go," I shouted, holding up the miner's tag like it was some kind of shield. The creature turned its glowing eyes on me but didn't move closer. It seemed wary of the tag's power. "You want me?" I said, stepping forward despite every instinct telling me to run. "Take me instead." "No," Peter cried out, struggling against its grip. I didn't give him a choice. I lunged forward and pressed the tag against my own chest while shouting words I didn't even understand, but somehow felt right. There was another blinding flash of light as pain shot through my entire body, but it worked. The Wendigo released Peter and let out one final screech before collapsing into ash that scattered across the cavern floor like snowflakes. Peter ran to me as I fell to my knees, barely able to keep myself upright. "Dad," he sobbed, grabbing my shoulders. "It's okay," I whispered weakly. "You're safe now." But deep down, I knew this wasn't over. Not for me. Peter helped me to my feet, his hands trembling as he tried to steady me. The cavern around us began to rumble, the walls cracking and shifting like the mountain itself was waking up. We didn't have much time. "Dad, we have to go," Peter shouted, pulling me toward the tunnel we'd fallen through. I nodded, though every step felt heavier than the last. My chest burned where I'd pressed the miner's tag, and my vision blurred as if something inside me was breaking apart. But I couldn't stop. Not yet. The tunnels twisted and turned, but somehow Peter seemed to know the way. Maybe it was luck, or maybe it was something else guiding him. Either way, we finally saw a faint light ahead, the opening we'd fallen through. Snow was still pouring in, but it was our only way out. Peter climbed up first, using roots and jagged rocks to pull himself through the narrow gap. I followed as best I could, my body screaming in protest with every movement. By the time we reached the surface, dawn was breaking over Black Hollow. The blizzard had stopped. The forest was still and quiet, the snow glistening under the soft morning light. It looked almost peaceful, like none of it had ever happened. But I knew better. Peter helped me back to the RV, which was leaning at an odd angle where part of the ground had collapsed beneath it. The damage didn't matter. We just needed it to get us out of there. "Are you okay?" Peter asked as he started the engine. I nodded weakly, though I could feel something wasn't right. My hands were shaking, and when I looked down at them, I noticed faint black smudges, coal dust that wouldn't wipe off no matter how hard I tried. Peter drove us down the mountain in silence, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. Neither of us spoke until we reached the main road leading back to town. "We made it," he said quietly, almost like he didn't believe it himself. I forced a smile and patted his shoulder. "You did good, kid." But deep down I knew this wasn't over. Not for me. 6 months later, Peter returned to Black Hollow alone. He'd spent those months researching everything he could about the Wendigo shaman and the curse that haunted those mountains. He didn't tell anyone where he was going, not even me, because he knew I wouldn't be able to stop him. I watched him from a distance that day, standing at the edge of the forest as he unloaded equipment from his truck. He looked older somehow, more determined than I'd ever seen him before. As he disappeared into the trees, I felt a strange mix of pride and dread. Part of me wanted to call out to him, to stop him from going back into that cursed place, but another part of me knew this was something he had to do for both of us. I turned away and walked back toward my own truck, brushing coal dust off my hands for what felt like the 100th time that day. When I glanced at my reflection in the side mirror, my eyes flashed green for just a moment before fading back to normal. The hunger was still there, quiet for now, but growing stronger every day. My name is Michael Adler. I'm 28 years old, a Vietnam veteran, and well, I guess you could say I'm a bit of a mess. After the war, I wasn't the same. My parents, Frank and Louise, thought a road trip across America in their shiny new RV might help me heal. They said it would be good for all of us. I didn't argue much. I didn't have the energy to. It started out fine. My dad was so proud of that 1965 GMC motorhome, always calling it his retirement dream on wheels. Mom packed enough food to last us a month, and they both seemed happy to have me along. But things took a turn when we hit road construction somewhere near the Arizona-Nevada border. The detour sign pointed us down an unmarked desert road, and before we knew it, we were in the middle of nowhere. At first, it didn't seem too bad. Just miles of sand and rocks stretching out under a blazing sun. But then the RV started acting up. The radio cut out, leaving only static and these faint whispers that made my skin crawl. The air conditioning stopped working next, and my dad couldn't figure out why. He said something about the electrical system being fried, but that didn't make sense. The RV was brand new. We stopped at this tiny gas station, one of those old ones with peeling paint and a single pump. That's where we met Iris Thornwell. She was an anthropologist, she said, studying Native American cultures in the area. She looked like she'd been out in the desert for days, dusty clothes, sunburned skin, but she seemed friendly enough. Be careful out there, Iris warned us as she filled her canteen with water from a rusty spigot. This land has stories, warnings. Warnings about what? My mom asked, her voice light but curious. Iris hesitated for a moment before answering. There's something out here, something old. We laughed it off at first, just another desert ghost story to scare tourists. But as we drove deeper into the desert, things got stranger. The road seemed to loop back on itself no matter which way we turned. Landmarks started looking familiar even though we'd never been there before. A jagged rock shaped like a claw, an old wooden sign half buried in sand. And then there was the amber residue. It showed up on the RV one morning after we'd camped overnight near some weird rock formations. At first I thought it was tree sap or something, but there weren't any trees around, just sand and stone as far as the eye could see. My mom tried to scrape it off with a knife, but it hardened in the sunlight like glass. By nightfall, though, it would dissolve completely. I started having these episodes, flashbacks from Vietnam mixed with strange images I couldn't explain, faces I didn't recognize, places I'd never been. My dad said it was just my mind playing tricks on me because of the heat or stress or whatever, but deep down I knew something wasn't right. At an isolated diner we stumbled upon, one of those places that feels frozen in time, we met Sheriff Raymond Blackhorse. He was a Native American lawman with sharp eyes and a calm voice that carried weight. "You folks shouldn't be out here," he said after hearing about our troubles. "People go missing in these parts." "Missing?" my dad asked skeptically. The sheriff nodded slowly. "There's an old legend about this land, a shapeshifter that steals faces, skins." Iris perked up at that point. "You mean the skin thief?" The sheriff shot her a look that shut her up quick. "Just stick together," he said firmly before walking away. That night in the RV, I couldn't sleep. Something about what he'd said stuck with me, like a splinter lodged deep in my mind. Around midnight, I heard its soft footsteps on the roof of the motorhome. At first, I thought it was just my imagination or maybe an animal passing by, but when I looked outside in the moonlight, there were handprints on the windows longer than any human hand should be. The next morning, I didn't say anything about the handprints. I wasn't sure if anyone would believe me, or if I even believed myself. But something about the air felt heavy, like the desert itself was watching us. My dad was busy tinkering with the RV's electrical system, muttering under his breath about how nothing makes sense. Mom was making breakfast, acting like everything was fine, but I could tell she was nervous. She kept glancing at the windows. Iris came by with some old photographs she'd taken of cave paintings in the area. She spread them out on the little table in the RV while we ate. The images were strange. Figures with stretched out limbs and hollow eyes standing over what looked like human skins laid out like blankets. "This is what I've been researching," Iris said, her voice low. "These petroglyphs are warnings left by the tribes who lived here centuries ago. They called it the skin thief." My mom frowned. "You really think something like that exists?" Iris shrugged. "I don't know what to believe anymore. But people have been disappearing here for years." "Enough with the ghost stories," my dad said, trying to laugh it off. "It's just some local legend to scare people." But then Iris showed us another photo, a blurry one she'd taken of the same cave paintings. Only this time, the figures looked like they were moving, their limbs shifting ever so slightly. "That's impossible," my dad said, leaning closer to inspect it. "I thought so too," Iris replied. "But every time I photograph them, they come out like this, like they're alive." That afternoon, we reached an old trading post that wasn't marked on any map. It looked abandoned, dusty windows, a sagging roof, but there were signs that someone had been there recently. Half-eaten meals sat on tables inside, and ceremonial objects were scattered around like they'd been dropped in a hurry. I wandered off while my parents and Iris explored the main building. Something about the place made my skin crawl, but I couldn't stop myself from looking around. In one of the back rooms, I found something that made my stomach turn, a hidden space filled with what looked like stretched-out human skins hanging on frames, almost like leather being tanned. I stumbled back into the main room, my heart pounding. "We need to leave," I said, my voice shaking. "What's wrong?" my mom asked. "I don't know how to explain it," I stammered. "But we shouldn't be here." Before anyone could respond, a sudden dust storm rolled in out of nowhere. The wind howled around the building, and sand battered against the windows so hard it sounded like rain. We tried to wait it out inside, but when the storm finally passed, Iris was gone. We searched everywhere, inside and outside, but there was no sign of her except for her backpack lying in the dirt near the RV. My dad wanted to leave right away, but Sheriff Blackhorse showed up just as we were packing up. "She's not coming back," he said bluntly, when we told him what happened. "What do you mean?" my mom asked, her voice trembling. The sheriff sighed and pulled a copper badge off his belt. "This is all that'll protect you now," he said, handing it to me. "Copper is the only thing that can hurt it." "Hurt what?" my dad demanded. "The skin thief," Blackhorse replied calmly. "It's been here longer than any of us can remember. It doesn't leave footprints. It can't be photographed or tracked, but it can mimic anyone it sees perfectly." I felt a chill run down my spine as he spoke. "Stay together," he warned us before walking back to his truck. "And don't trust anyone who starts acting different." That night, we stayed in the RV again, too scared to go anywhere else. My mom kept looking at my dad like she wanted to say something but didn't know how. Finally, she pulled me aside while he was outside checking on something. "Michael," she whispered urgently, "does your father seem off to you?" "What do you mean?" I asked. "He's been saying things he's never said before," she replied nervously. "And earlier, he called me by a nickname he hasn't used since we first got married." I didn't know what to say. My dad had seemed normal enough to me, maybe a little quieter than usual, but now that she mentioned it, there were little things that didn't add up. Later that night, as we sat around the tiny table in the RV pretending everything was fine, I noticed something else. My dad's scar, the one he'd gotten years ago from a car accident, was on the wrong shoulder. My heart sank as realization hit me like a punch to the gut. That wasn't my dad. I didn't say anything right away. I just stared at him at bedtime, trying to figure out what to do. My mom must have noticed the look on my face because she whispered, "Michael, what's wrong?" I leaned closer to her and said quietly, "That's not Dad." Her eyes widened, and for a moment she didn't move. Then she glanced at him, at the man sitting across from us, and I could see the fear in her face. He was humming softly to himself, tapping his fingers on the table. It was something my dad used to do, but now it felt wrong. "Are you okay?" he asked suddenly, looking up at us. His voice sounded almost normal, but there was something off about it, like he was trying too hard to sound casual. "Yeah," I said quickly, forcing a smile. "Just tired." He nodded and went back to humming. I grabbed my mom's arm and pulled her into the tiny bathroom at the back of the RV. "We need to get out of here," I whispered. "How do you know it's not him?" she asked, her voice shaking. "His scar," I said. "It's on the wrong shoulder." She froze for a second, then nodded. "What do we do?" I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that we couldn't stay in the RV with whatever that thing was. When we stepped out of the bathroom, he was gone. The door to the RV was wide open, and the desert night stretched out in front of us like a black void. My mom grabbed my arm tightly. "Michael," she whispered. "Where did he go?" Before I could answer, we heard footsteps outside, slow and deliberate. Then his voice called out from somewhere in the darkness. "Louise? Michael? Where are you?" My mom started shaking her head, whispering over and over. "That's not him. That's not him." I grabbed the copper badge Sheriff Blackhorse had given me earlier and held it tightly in my hand. "Stay behind me," I told her. We stepped outside into the cool night air, and that's when we saw him, or asterisk. He was standing about 20 feet away, just barely visible in the moonlight. His posture was wrong, too stiff, and his movements were jerky as he started walking toward us. "Come back inside," he said calmly. "It's not safe out here." I held up the badge like it was a shield. "Stay back," I shouted. He stopped for a moment, tilting his head like he was confused. Then his face changed. It stretched slightly, like someone pulling on a mask, and his eyes turned amber. My mom gasped and stumbled backward as asterisk lunged toward us. I swung the badge at it as hard as I could, hitting its arm. The creature let out a horrible screech and stumbled back, clutching its arm where I'd hit it. The skin there started bubbling and peeling away like wax melting under heat. "Run," I yelled. We bolted toward the trading post in the distance, the only place nearby that might offer some kind of shelter. My mom was crying quietly as we ran, but she didn't stop or look back. When we reached the trading post, we slammed the door shut behind us and locked it with an old wooden bar we found lying nearby. The place felt even creepier at night. Shadows danced across the walls from our flashlight, and every creak of the floorboards made my heart race. "What is that thing?" my mom whispered. "I don't know," I admitted. "But Sheriff Blackhorse said copper hurts it." She nodded slowly, wiping tears from her face. "What do we do now?" Before I could answer, we heard footsteps outside again, soft and careful this time, and then a knock at the door. "It's me," a voice called out. It sounded like Iris. My mom looked at me hopefully. "Do you think it's really her?" I shook my head. The knocking continued for a few minutes before stopping completely. Then everything went quiet. Too quiet. Suddenly, one of the windows shattered as something burst through it, a figure wearing Iris's face but moving in ways no human ever could. Its limbs stretched unnaturally as it crawled toward us like some kind of insect. I grabbed an old copper pot off one of the shelves and swung it at the creature as hard as I could. It screamed again, flailing wildly before retreating back through the broken window into the darkness. "We can't stay here," I said breathlessly. My mom nodded quickly, and we ran back outside toward the RV. The creature followed us through the shadows, sometimes appearing as Iris, sometimes as my dad, but its movements gave it away every time. When we reached the RV, Sheriff Blackhorse appeared out of nowhere with his revolver drawn. He fired twice at the creature with bullets loaded with copper tips, hitting it square in the chest both times. The thing shrieked louder than ever before and collapsed onto the ground for a moment before scrambling away into the night. "You have to finish this," Blackhorse said urgently as he handed me his revolver. "What about you?" I asked. He shook his head slowly. "It'll come for me first." Before I could stop him, he walked off into the darkness after the creature, and then there was another scream, followed by silence. The silence after Sheriff Blackhorse's scream was crushing. My mom and I stood there, frozen, staring into the dark desert. I wanted to run after him, but deep down, I knew it was too late. He was gone. "We can't stay here," I said, my voice trembling. "We have to end this." "How?" my mom asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She looked so small and scared, clutching her arms like she was trying to hold herself together. I thought about what Black Horse had said about copper being the only thing that could hurt it. I still had his revolver, but only a few bullets were left. That wouldn't be enough. Then an idea hit me. A desperate, insane idea. "The RV," I said suddenly. "The plumbing system. It's full of copper pipes. We can use them to trap it." My mom looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "Michael, how are we supposed to do that? It's too dangerous." "I don't know," I admitted, "but we don't have a choice." We hurried back to the RV and started ripping out anything made of copper, pipes, wiring, even the little fittings under the sink. My hands shook as I worked, but I kept going. Every second felt like an eternity, and every shadow outside the RV made me jump. Then came the sound we'd been dreading, footsteps circling the RV. "It's here," my mom whispered, her face pale. I loaded one of the copper bullets into Black Horse's revolver and handed my mom a piece of copper pipe. "Stay inside," I told her. "Don't open the door for anyone, not even me." "What are you going to do?" she asked, tears welling up in her eyes. I hesitated for a moment before answering. "I'm going to lure it here." "No," she cried, grabbing my arm. "You can't. It'll kill you." "It's already killed too many people," I said firmly. "This has to end." Before she could stop me, I stepped outside into the cool night air. The desert was eerily quiet again, except for the faint crunch of sand under my boots as I walked a few feet away from the RV. "I know you're out there," I shouted into the darkness. "Come and get me." For a moment, nothing happened. Then I saw it. A figure emerging from the shadows. This time, it was wearing my dad's face again. But its movements were all wrong, jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on strings. "Michael," it said in my dad's voice, smiling that same warm smile he used to give me when I was a kid. "It doesn't have to be this way. You're not him," I yelled, raising the revolver. The creature tilted its head and took another step forward. Its skin started shifting as it moved, stretching and bubbling like wax melting in a fire. Then it dropped all pretense and shed my dad's skin completely. What stood before me now wasn't human at all. Its body was translucent and amber-colored, its limbs impossibly long and thin. Its eyes glowed faintly in the moonlight as it stared at me with an expression that almost looked curious. I fired a shot straight into its chest. The creature let out a horrible screech and stumbled back, but it didn't fall. Instead, it lunged at me with terrifying speed. I barely had time to dodge as one of its claw-like hands swiped at my face. I ran toward the RV as fast as I could, shouting for my mom to get ready. The creature was right behind me. I could hear its heavy breathing and feel the ground tremble with each step it took. When I reached the RV, I dove inside and slammed the door shut behind me. My mom had already set up the copper pipes around the entrance like we'd planned. "Now," I yelled. She turned on the water pump we'd rigged earlier, flooding the area around the RV with water from our storage tank. The creature hesitated for a moment before stepping into the water, and that's when it screamed again. The combination of copper and running water seemed to weaken it somehow. Its body started dissolving at the edges, like sugar melting in hot tea. But it wasn't enough to kill it completely. "We need more," my mom shouted. I looked at her pale face and trembling hands, and realized what she was thinking before she even said it. "No," I said firmly. "We'll find another way." "There is no other way," she replied softly. "You know that." Tears streamed down her face as she grabbed one of the copper pipes and stepped toward the door. Before I could stop her, she opened it just wide enough for the creature to see her. "Come on," she screamed at it. "Is this what you want?" The creature lunged at her instantly, but she swung the pipe with all her strength, hitting it square in the head before collapsing onto the ground. "Mom," I screamed, rushing to her side. She was still alive, but barely. Blood pooled around her as she looked up at me with tear-filled eyes. "You have to finish this," she whispered weakly. "No," I said desperately, shaking my head. "I can't do this without you." "Yes, you can," she said with a faint smile before closing her eyes for the last time. I clenched my fists tightly as anger and grief consumed me. Using what little strength I had left, I set up one final trap inside the trading post nearby, a circle of copper pipes connected by wires from our RV's electrical system. Then I carried my mom's body into the center of the trap and waited for the creature to come back. When it finally arrived, still wearing pieces of its translucent form, I pretended to be unconscious beside her body. As soon as it stepped into the circle to take her skin, I activated the trap by connecting two loose wires together. The entire room lit up with sparks as electricity surged through the copper pipe surrounding us, and through *it*. The creature let out one final ear-piercing scream before collapsing into a puddle of amber-colored goo that slowly dissolved into nothingness. For a moment, everything was silent again. Just me sitting there alone in that dark room with my mom's lifeless body beside me. I don't remember much about what happened after that. I must have dragged myself back to the RV somehow, driving through the desert until the looping roads finally broke and I found my way to the highway. The sun was rising by the time I reached Civilization, a small town with a diner sitting right off the road. I parked the RV in the lot and just sat there for a while staring at my hands. They were covered in dried blood, hers, and I couldn't bring myself to clean them. My mom was gone. My dad was gone. And Sheriff Blackhorse, he'd sacrificed himself for people he barely knew. I should have felt something. Grief, anger, relief. But all I felt was empty. Eventually, hunger won out. I stepped into the diner, the bell above the door jingling softly. It was quiet inside, just a few locals sipping coffee and chatting about nothing important. A waitress came over to me with a warm smile. "Morning," she said cheerfully. "Coffee?" I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. She poured me a cup and set it down in front of me. Her hands were steady, her movements smooth, but something about her felt familiar. "What'll it be?" she asked, pulling out a notepad. I glanced at her name tag, *Louise. My stomach twisted, but I forced myself to stay calm. "Just eggs and toast," I said quietly. She smiled again and walked off toward the kitchen. As I watched her go, little things started standing out. The way she tucked her hair behind her ear, the way she hummed under her breath while she worked. They were things my mom used to do. I shook my head, telling myself it was just my imagination. But when she brought my food over and set it down in front of me, she said something that made my blood run cold. "Eat up," she said with a smile. "You always loved eggs when you were little." I froze, staring at her. "What did you say?" She tilted her head slightly, looking confused. "Eggs," she repeated slowly. "You loved them as a kid." I hadn't told anyone that. Not Iris, not Blackhorse, not even my dad during this trip. It wasn't something I talked about. It wasn't something anyone else would know. I looked down at my plate and noticed something else, amber residue smeared on the edge of the silverware. My heart started pounding as I looked back up at her face, her warm smile now feeling like a mask hiding something sinister. "I'll be right back," she said casually. Before disappearing into the kitchen, I didn't wait. I reached under my jacket and pulled out one of the copper pipes I'd taken from the RV earlier. My hands were shaking as I stood up and followed her into the back of the diner. The kitchen was empty, too empty, and silent, except for the faint hum of an old refrigerator in the corner. Then I heard it, soft footsteps behind me. When I turned around, she was standing there, still smiling, but her eyes weren't right anymore. They glowed faintly, amber in the dim light. "You don't have to be afraid," she said softly, stepping closer to me. "It's just me. Your mom." "No," I whispered, gripping the pipe tightly in both hands. "You're not her." Her smile faltered for a moment before stretching wider than any human mouth should be able to. Her skin started bubbling and shifting as she took another step forward. "Michael," she said in a voice that sounded like my mom's but wasn't quite right anymore. "You can come with me now." I swung the pipe as hard as I could, hitting her square in the chest. She let out a horrible screech and stumbled backward into one of the counters, knocking over pots and pans as she collapsed onto the floor. For a moment, everything went quiet again, just me standing there alone in that dark kitchen with my heart racing so hard it hurt. When I stepped outside into the morning sunlight, people were staring at me like I'd lost my mind, but I didn't care anymore. I climbed back into the RV and drove away without looking back. As far as I'm concerned, that thing is still out there somewhere, wearing someone else's face now, waiting for its next victim. But if it ever comes for me again, I'll be ready. My name is Gregory Walsh. I'm a wildlife photographer, though lately I've been feeling more like a man running from his own shadow. After my divorce, I needed to get away from everything. My failed marriage, the city, and the constant noise in my head. So I bought an old Airstream trailer from the 70s and decided to head out to Olympic National Park in Washington. It was supposed to be a quiet trip, just me and my camera. But life has a way of throwing curveballs. Do we really have to do this? Emily, my 16-year-old daughter, grumbled as she sat in the passenger seat of my truck. She had her headphones on, but she wasn't listening to music. She just wanted to block me out. Typical teenager. "Yes, we do," I said firmly. "This is our chance to reconnect." She rolled her eyes so hard I thought they might pop out of her head. We arrived at the campground late in the afternoon. The place was supposed to be closed for renovations, but when we got there, the gate was unlocked. A handwritten note taped to the post read, "The shut campground closed, enter at your own risk." It didn't seem official, but I figured it was just someone trying to keep people out while they worked. Besides, I'd called ahead weeks ago and gotten permission from someone at the park office. The campground was eerily quiet. No other cars, no people. Just us and miles of towering pine trees. The air smelled fresh and earthy, but there was something else too, something faintly metallic that I couldn't quite place. As we set up camp near the edge of the forest, Emily wandered off with her phone in hand, probably looking for a signal. I busied myself unpacking gear and setting up my cameras. Photography was my escape. It gave me a reason to focus on something other than my own thoughts. "Dad." Emily's voice cut through the stillness like a knife. I dropped what I was doing and ran toward her voice. She stood near a patch of dirt just beyond our campsite, pointing at something on the ground. "What is that?" she asked. I crouched down to take a closer look. There were footprints, huge ones, pressed deep into the soil. They were easily twice the size of my boot and shaped like an oversized human foot with long toes. Too big to be a bear. Too human to be anything else. "I don't know," I admitted, trying to sound calm for her sake. "Probably just some kind of prank." Emily didn't look convinced, but she didn't argue either. That night, as we sat around a small campfire eating canned chili, the forest came alive with strange sounds. At first, it was just the usual rustling of leaves and distant hoots of owls. But then came something else. A rhythmic knocking sound that echoed from multiple directions at once. Asterisk, knock, knock, knock. It wasn't random like branches falling or animals moving through the brush. It was deliberate. "What is that?" Emily whispered, her eyes wide with fear. I shrugged, trying to play it off as nothing, probably woodpeckers or something. But deep down, I knew it wasn't woodpeckers. Later that night, after Emily had gone to bed in the trailer, I stayed up reviewing some photos I'd taken earlier in the day. That's when I noticed something strange. In one photo of the tree line near our campsite, some of the trees looked different. They weren't where they should have been, not according to how I remembered framing the shot. I shook my head and laughed nervously at myself. "You're just tired," I muttered under my breath. The next morning brought more questions than answers. As we stepped outside the trailer to stretch our legs, we found strange symbols arranged around our campsite, pine cones and twigs, carefully placed in intricate patterns that looked almost like runes or hieroglyphs. "Did you do this?" Emily asked accusingly. "No," I said firmly. "And don't touch them." She didn't need me to tell her twice. She backed away quickly. As we tried to make sense of what was happening, a woman appeared from deeper in the woods carrying a small metal case filled with samples of plants and soil. She introduced herself as Michelle Parker, a biologist studying unusual growth patterns in the area. "This forest is unique," she said cryptically, when we showed her one of the symbols we'd found. "There's something about it that doesn't follow normal rules." "What do you mean?" I asked. She hesitated before answering. "I mean, things grow faster here than they should, and sometimes they grow wrong." Her words sent a chill down my spine. That night was worse than the first. Emily woke up screaming around midnight, not from inside the trailer but from somewhere outside in the woods. I bolted upright and grabbed a flashlight before running out into the darkness calling her name. My heart pounded as I followed her voice until finally finding her standing barefoot among the trees about 50 yards from our campsite. "Emily," I shouted as I ran toward her. She turned slowly toward me with a dazed look on her face. "I don't remember walking here," she said softly. I wrapped my arms around her and guided her back to safety without saying another word. But inside, panic clawed at me like an animal trapped in a cage. The next day brought more unsettling discoveries, more symbols around our campsite, more strange photos showing trees that seemed to move when no one was looking, more questions without answers. Whatever was happening here, it wasn't natural. The storm came out of nowhere. One minute, the skies were clear, and the next, dark clouds rolled in like a wave crashing over the forest. The wind howled through the trees, bending them until it seemed like they might snap. Emily and I hurried to secure the trailer, but before we could finish, the rain started pouring down in sheets. By the time we got inside, soaked and shivering, it felt like the forest was closing in on us. The storm had knocked down several trees around our campsite, forming a perfect circle that trapped us. There was no way to drive out now. The path was completely blocked. Emily sat on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, staring out the window at the rain. "This place feels wrong," she said quietly. I didn't know what to say. She wasn't wrong. Something about this forest did feel wrong. As we waited for the storm to pass, there was a knock at the door. It startled both of us. Who would be out here in this weather? I opened the door cautiously to find a young man standing there, drenched from head to toe. He looked about 25, with messy brown hair and a backpack slung over one shoulder. "Sorry to bother you," he said sheepishly. "I got lost trying to hike through the park and saw your trailer." I hesitated for a moment, but eventually let him in. He introduced himself as Jesse Underwood and claimed he'd been hiking for days before getting caught in the storm. Emily didn't trust him right away. She kept her distance and watched him carefully as he warmed up by our small heater. I couldn't blame her. Something about him felt off. That night, Jesse joined us for dinner, telling stories about his travels. But as he talked, I noticed something strange. His story kept changing. First, he said he'd been hiking alone for 3 days. Then it was 5 days. Then he mentioned meeting another hiker who'd given him directions, but later he said he hadn't seen anyone else on the trail. Emily leaned over and whispered to me, "He's lying." I nodded subtly but didn't say anything. If Jesse was lying, I wanted to figure out why before confronting him. The next morning, Emily woke me up early with more bad news. "Dad, look at this." She pointed outside at Jesse's backpack, which had been left near the trailer overnight. It was open slightly, and inside were several strange items: a jar filled with amber-colored fluid, a bundle of twigs tied together with hair that looked human, and a notebook filled with symbols similar to the ones we'd found around our campsite. "What is this stuff?" Emily asked nervously. "I don't know," I admitted, my stomach twisting into knots. Before we could investigate further, Jesse appeared behind us suddenly. "Everything okay?" he asked casually, though his tone felt forced. Emily froze like a deer caught in headlights while I tried to act normal. "Yeah," I said quickly. "Just getting ready for breakfast." Jesse didn't seem convinced, but didn't press further. Later that day, we decided to explore deeper into the forest to see if we could find another way out. That's when we met Donovan Russell, a retired forest ranger who seemed to know these woods better than anyone else. "You shouldn't be here," Donovan said bluntly when we told him about our situation. "This campground was closed for a reason." "What reason?" I asked. Donovan hesitated before answering. "There are things in these woods that don't belong here." "What kind of things?" Emily asked nervously. He sighed heavily and looked around as if checking to make sure no one else was listening. "We call them asterisk. The Watchers asterisk. They've been here longer than any of us can remember." I didn't know what to make of his words. They sounded like something out of a campfire story meant to scare kids, but Donovan's expression was dead serious. Michelle Parker joined us later that day as we tried to piece together what was happening. She brought maps showing areas where researchers had gone missing over the years. Dozens of disappearances clustered around this part of the forest. "This isn't just coincidence," Michelle said firmly as she pointed at one cluster on the map. "Something is drawing people here and keeping them." Emily grew quieter as the day went on, clutching her head occasionally like she had a headache. When I asked her what was wrong, she whispered something that sent chills down my spine. "I can hear them." "Hear who?" I asked gently. "The Watchers," she said softly. "They're talking about us." I didn't know how to respond. How could she hear something? None of us could. But her pale face and trembling hands told me she wasn't imagining it. That night was worse than any before it. Jesse disappeared without warning while we slept. His backpack left behind near the trailer along with his clothes neatly folded in a pile outside. The jar of amber fluid was missing too. "Where did he go?" Emily asked fearfully as we searched for him in vain. Michelle shook her head grimly. "He didn't go anywhere. Not as himself." Her cryptic words made no sense at first, but then we found more symbols arranged around our campsite along with fresh footprints leading deeper into the woods. Footprints far too large to belong to Jesse or anyone else human. The forest itself seemed alive now, roots creeping closer to our trailer like fingers reaching out for us while branches swayed unnaturally even when there was no wind. Whatever was happening here, it wasn't just strange anymore, it was dangerous. The next morning, the forest felt heavier. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and the strange metallic smell was stronger than ever. Emily stayed close to me, her usual teenage defiance replaced by quiet fear. Even Michelle, who had seemed so confident before, looked uneasy. We decided to search for Jesse, or at least figure out what had happened to him. Donovan led the way, his old ranger instincts kicking in as he scanned the ground for tracks. The footprints we'd found earlier were still there, leading deeper into the woods. They were massive, easily twice the size of a human foot, with long toes that dug deep into the soil. As we followed the trail, Emily suddenly stopped and grabbed my arm. "Dad," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They're watching us." I glanced around but didn't see anything. "Who's watching us?" I asked. She pointed toward the trees. "Them." I followed her gaze but saw nothing, just shadows and branches swaying in the breeze. But then I noticed something strange. The shadows didn't move like they should have. They shifted too quickly, darting between trees in ways that made my stomach churn. "Keep moving," Donovan said sharply, his voice low but firm. "Don't stop." We pressed on until we came across an abandoned research station hidden deep in the forest. The building was small and weathered, with moss growing over its walls and broken windows that let in beams of pale light. Inside, we found journals scattered across a dusty desk. Michelle picked one up and flipped through the pages. Her face turned pale as she read aloud. "Blood-doe, undocumented primate species, signs of advanced intelligence, telepathic communication." "What does that mean?" I asked. "It means someone knew about this," Michelle said grimly. "They were studying them." Emily wandered over to a corner of the room where a large map was pinned to the wall. It was covered in red X's marking locations throughout the forest, places where people had disappeared. "This is where they take them," Emily said quietly, tracing her finger along the map. Before I could respond, Donovan spoke up from near the doorway. "We need to leave. Now." "What's wrong?" I asked. He didn't answer right away, just stared out into the forest with a look of pure fear on his face. "They're coming." We barely made it back to camp before nightfall. As soon as we arrived, we noticed something was wrong. The trailer was surrounded by roots and branches that hadn't been there before. They twisted around the wheels like they were trying to pull it into the ground. Michelle tried to cut through one of the roots with a knife, but it was no use. They were too thick and tough. "We're trapped," she said flatly. That night, Emily's headaches got worse. She curled up on the couch with her hands pressed against her temples, tears streaming down her face. "They're so loud," she whispered over and over again. "Who's loud?" I asked gently. "The Watchers," she said through gritted teeth. "They're talking about us, studying us." I didn't know what to do. My daughter was in pain. We were trapped in this cursed forest, and whatever was out there wasn't going to let us leave without a fight. Then came the fog. It rolled in slowly at first, creeping between the trees like a living thing. Within minutes, it was so thick we couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction. The world outside our trailer disappeared into a wall of white, and then we heard it. The humming. It started as a low vibration that made my chest feel tight, like standing too close to a speaker at a concert. But then it grew louder, more distinct. A deep, rhythmic sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Emily clutched her head and screamed as if the sound was tearing her apart from the inside. "Make it stop," she cried. I held her tightly, whispering words of comfort even though I knew they wouldn't help. Michelle stood by the window, staring out into the fog with wide eyes. "They're here," she said softly, and then she was gone. One moment she was standing there. The next, something crashed through the window and dragged her out into the night before any of us could react. All that was left behind was broken glass and a trail of crushed vegetation leading into the fog. "Michelle," I shouted, but there was no answer. Only silence, broken by that terrible humming sound. Donovan grabbed my arm and pulled me back toward Emily. "There's nothing we can do for her now," he said grimly. "We need to focus on surviving." But even as he spoke those words, I saw something flicker in his eyes. Guilt. "What aren't you telling us?" I demanded. Donovan hesitated before finally speaking. "My family has lived near these woods for generations," he admitted quietly. "We've always known about them." "The Watchers. You knew?" I asked angrily. "And you brought us here anyway." "I didn't have a choice," he said bitterly. "They demand sacrifices, people to keep them satisfied." Emily stared at him in horror. "You brought us here to die?" "No." Donovan insisted desperately. "I thought maybe you'd be different." Before I could respond, Emily interrupted us with a shaky voice. "They're not just watching us anymore." She pointed toward one of my cameras sitting on the table. It had been taking time-lapse photos throughout our trip, and when I looked at its screen, my blood ran cold. The last photo showed something standing just outside our trailer, a tall figure covered in dark fur with too many eyes staring directly at the lens. "They're coming," Donovan whispered again. The figure in the photo haunted me. It was tall, at least 9 feet, with long limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally. Its fur was dark and matted, blending into the shadows of the forest. But the worst part was its face. It had too many eyes, all staring directly at the camera like it knew we were watching. Emily sat frozen on the couch, her eyes wide with fear. Donovan paced back and forth, muttering under his breath. The fog outside grew thicker, pressing against the windows like it wanted to seep inside. "We can't stay here," I said finally. "We have to find a way out." Donovan shook his head. "There's no way out. Not unless they let us go." "What do you mean?" I demanded. "They control the forest," he said quietly. "The trees, the roots, the fog. It's all them. They decide who leaves and who doesn't." Emily stood up suddenly, her face pale but determined. "I can talk to them," she said. "Emily, no," I said firmly. "You don't know what they'll do. They're already talking to me," she replied softly. "I can hear them in my head. They're curious about us." Her words sent chills down my spine, but I couldn't deny she might be right. Whatever these things were, they weren't just animals, they were intelligent. Before I could stop her, Emily stepped outside into the fog. Donovan and I followed quickly, staying close as she knelt down and began arranging pine cones and twigs into one of the symbols we'd found earlier. "What are you doing?" I asked nervously. "Communicating," she said simply. The humming grew louder as she worked, vibrating through the ground beneath our feet. The fog swirled around us like it was alive, shifting and twisting in unnatural patterns. And then we saw them. The forest fathers emerged from the fog one by one, their massive forms blending seamlessly with the trees around them. There were at least 5 of them, maybe more. It was hard to tell in the haze. They moved slowly but deliberately, their many eyes fixed on Emily as she finished her symbol. One of them stepped closer, its long limbs bending unnaturally as it crouched down to examine her work. Its humming grew louder, almost deafening now, and Emily winced in pain but didn't stop. "They want something from us," she whispered. "What do they want?" Donovan asked nervously. Emily looked up at me with tears in her eyes. "They want me." "No," I shouted, grabbing her arm and pulling her back toward the trailer. "You're not going anywhere." But before we could move any further, the forest fathers surrounded us completely. Their presence was overwhelming, like standing next to a thunderstorm that you could feel in your bones. Donovan stepped forward suddenly, his hands raised in surrender. "Take me instead," he shouted. The forest fathers turned their many eyes toward him, their humming shifting into a lower tone that felt almost like speech. "They don't want you," Emily said softly. "They've already taken enough from you." Donovan's face crumpled in despair as he fell to his knees. "I'm sorry," he whispered. The forest fathers began moving closer, their long limbs reaching out toward Emily like they were trying to pull her away from me. "Run," Donovan shouted suddenly, grabbing a branch from the ground and swinging it wildly at one of the creatures. It didn't even flinch. It simply grabbed him with one massive hand and lifted him off the ground like he weighed nothing. Donovan screamed as the creature carried him into the fog, his voice fading quickly until there was only silence. Emily and I ran as fast as we could back toward the trailer. The forest fathers followed slowly but relentlessly, their humming growing louder with every step. When we reached the trailer, I grabbed my camera equipment, the only thing I had left that might help us, and began setting up flashes around the perimeter. "What are you doing?" Emily asked frantically. "They don't like light," I said quickly. "It might slow them down." As soon as they got close enough, I triggered the flashes all at once. The bright bursts of light seemed to disorient them. They stopped moving for a moment, their many eyes blinking rapidly as they tried to adjust. "Go," I shouted, grabbing Emily's hand and pulling her toward the truck. We climbed inside and started the engine just as the forest fathers began moving again. The roots around our trailer had loosened slightly during the commotion, giving us just enough space to drive through. The truck tore through the forest at full speed, dodging fallen branches and massive roots that seemed to reach out for us like hands trying to grab hold. The fog made it nearly impossible to see where we were going, but somehow we managed to find our way back to an old service road leading out of the park. As we drove away, Emily clutched her head again with tears streaming down her face. "They're still talking to me," she whispered. "What are they saying?" I asked nervously. She looked up at me with a haunted expression. "They let us go because they want me to carry them outside." I didn't understand what she meant at first, but then I noticed something strange about her hands. Small seedlings were growing from beneath her fingernails, their tiny roots curling around her skin like they belonged there. We escaped that forest, but part of it escaped with us. My name is Alice Dunham, and I never thought a simple family trip to the Maine coastline would change my life forever. We were supposed to be vacationing, just enjoying the sights and sounds of New England. My dad, Howard, had recently bought one of those fancy new RVs, the kind people stared at like it was a spaceship. He called it his land yacht and said it was the perfect way to see America properly. My mom, Margaret, wasn't thrilled about it, but she went along with his plans like she always did. I wasn't exactly excited either. I'm 19, studying marine biology in college, and this trip felt like another way for Dad to remind me how much he disapproved of my career choice. He thought I should study something practical, like business, but I've always been drawn to the ocean, maybe too drawn. We arrived at this tiny peninsula in Maine late in the afternoon. It was remote, just cliffs, crashing waves, and a small fishing village nearby. The tide was unusually low when we got there, exposing strange ruins on the shore that looked like they belonged in some ancient underwater city. Dad ignored all warnings from the locals about parking too close to the cliff edge. He said he wanted the best view in America. That first night, something felt off. The air was heavy with salt and dampness, and the sound of the waves crashing against the rocks seemed louder than usual. I woke up in the middle of the night to find myself standing outside the RV, barefoot on cold grass, staring at the ocean. I don't remember how I got there. My mom found me and pulled me back inside before I could go any closer to the edge. She didn't say much but kept glancing at me like she was worried about something she couldn't explain. The next morning, we found strange patterns around our RV, shells arranged in spirals and seaweed twisted into shapes that looked almost deliberate. Dad laughed it off and said it was probably kids from the village playing pranks, but when I picked up one of those shells, it felt warm in my hand, almost like it was alive. As we explored the area over the next few days, things only got stranger. I started finding unusual specimens near the water, fish with human-like features or shells that shimmered unnaturally under sunlight. My dad began acting weird too. He'd always been afraid of water, but now he couldn't stop talking about swimming in the ocean. He spent hours sitting near the edge of the cliff, staring at the waves as if they were calling to him. One evening, we visited an old lighthouse nearby and met Edwin Porter, its keeper. He was an odd man, gruff but strangely kind, and he seemed nervous about us being there during what he called spring tide season. He warned us about those who lived beneath and said we should leave before things got worse. My dad laughed at him and said he'd heard enough ghost stories for one lifetime. That night, as I lay in bed inside the RV, I heard something new, a faint singing coming from the ocean. It wasn't human, it was haunting and beautiful all at once. When I asked my parents if they could hear it too, they looked at me like I was crazy. I didn't know it then, but that was only the beginning. The days that followed felt like a dream I couldn't wake up from. A strange, heavy dream where everything seemed just a little off. The ocean was always there, restless and loud, as if it had something to say but couldn't quite get the words out. I couldn't stop thinking about the singing I'd heard that night. It wasn't just in my head, I knew it wasn't. I started spending more time by the water, collecting samples and trying to make sense of what was happening. My dad didn't seem to care about my little experiments, as he called them. In fact, he barely talked to me or Mom at all anymore. He spent most of his time staring at the waves or walking along the shore, picking up shells and arranging them into patterns that looked eerily like the ones we'd been finding around the RV. One afternoon, I decided to visit Dr. Lawrence Palmer, a retired oceanographer who lived in isolation on the peninsula. I'd heard about him from a local fisherman who said Dr. Palmer knew things about the water. When I knocked on his door, he opened it just enough to see me and asked what I wanted. "I'm studying marine biology," I told him. "I've been finding unusual things near the shore." He hesitated for a moment before letting me in. His house smelled like salt and old books, and every surface was covered in papers and jars filled with strange specimens. He showed me his journals, decades of research documenting genetic abnormalities in local families. "There's something in the water here," he said quietly. "Something that's been here longer than any of us." I didn't know what to say, but his words stuck with me. When I got back to the RV, I noticed something strange, tiny spots of corrosion on the metal exterior. At first, I thought it was just rust from the salty air. But when I looked closer, I realized the patterns looked like scales. That night, things took another turn. The storm rolled in, fierce and sudden, with winds that howled like they were alive. As we huddled inside the RV, we saw lights out on the water, bright, shifting lights that moved too quickly to be boats. Then came the shadows, humanoid figures emerging from the waves and moving toward the shore. They didn't come close enough for us to see clearly, but their silhouettes were enough to make my mom grab my hand and hold on tight. The next morning, Officer Jared Wilson came by to check on us. He said a local fisherman had been found drowned near the ruins exposed by low tide. There were marks on him, he said hesitantly, like bite marks. My mom asked if it could have been a shark attack, but Officer Wilson shook his head. Sharks don't leave marks like these, he said. As he left, my mom pulled out an old photo album she'd brought along for the trip. One of those things she thought might bring us closer as a family. She flipped through pictures of my dad's childhood and stopped at one that made her go pale. It was a photo of his grandmother standing on a rocky shore that looked exactly like this peninsula. "Howard," she said slowly, "why didn't you tell me your family was from here?" My dad shrugged without looking up from his shell arrangements. "I didn't think it mattered," he said flatly. "But it did matter. It mattered more than any of us realized." Over the next few days, my body started changing in ways I couldn't explain or hide. Tiny scales appeared behind my ears, shimmering faintly under certain light. The skin between my fingers felt tighter, almost like webbing was forming there. I tried to ignore it, but deep down I knew something was happening to me. Dr. Palmer's words haunted me. "Why, when there's something in the water here." Asterisk. One evening during another low tide, my mom and I walked down to the ruins near the shore while my dad stayed behind at the RV. The ruins were even stranger up close, massive stone structures carved with symbols that didn't look like anything human hands could have made. As we explored, we found something buried in the sand, an old box filled with documents and photographs. Inside were letters written by my dad's grandmother, letters describing how she'd been drawn to this place during her youth, and how she'd disappeared during a spring tide over 50 years ago. When we got back to the RV, we found it had been moved during our absence, dragged closer to the cliff edge despite its heavy weight and locked wheels. That night, as another storm rolled in and lightning lit up the sky, I heard them again, the figures from before, closer this time. And then came the singing. By now, I couldn't deny it. Something was very wrong. The singing I'd been hearing at night wasn't just in my head, it was real. And the figures we saw during the storm, they weren't just shadows, they were something else, something that didn't belong on land. The next morning, I decided to confront my dad. "What's going on with you?" I asked him as he sat outside the RV, staring at the ocean like he always did now. "You're acting different." He didn't answer right away. He just kept arranging shells in those strange patterns, his hands moving slowly but deliberately. Finally, he said, "You wouldn't understand, Alice. This place, it has a way of calling people back. Calling people back." I repeated, confused. "What are you talking about?" Before he could answer, my mom came rushing out of the RV, holding one of the old letters we'd found in the ruins. "Howard," she said, her voice shaking, "why didn't you tell me your grandmother disappeared here? Why didn't you tell me this place is connected to your family?" My dad stood up slowly and turned to face her. For a moment, I thought he looked different. His skin seemed paler, almost translucent, and there was something strange about his eyes, like they were reflecting light in a way they shouldn't have been. "I didn't think it mattered," he said coldly, "but now I see it does." That night, I couldn't sleep. The storm had passed, but the air still felt heavy, like it was holding its breath. I kept hearing strange noises outside, soft splashes and whispers that didn't sound entirely human. Finally, I got up and went to the lighthouse to talk to Edwin Porter again. When I told him everything that had been happening, the singing, the figures in the water, my dad's strange behavior, he sighed heavily and motioned for me to follow him inside. "The lighthouse isn't just for guiding ships," he said as we climbed the spiral staircase to the top. "It's also a warning, a signal to keep them away." "Them?" I asked nervously. He nodded grimly. "The ones who live beneath the waves." Edwin explained that the creatures, he called them deep ones, had been here for centuries, living in an underwater city not far from the shore. They weren't just animals or monsters. They were something in between, something ancient and intelligent, and they had a connection to certain families in the area. Families with unusual bloodlines. Your father's family is one of them, Edwin said quietly. I froze. What do you mean? Some people carry their blood, he continued. It's dormant most of the time, but when they come back here, when they're near the ocean, it starts waking up. I felt sick to my stomach as his words sank in. Was that why my dad had been acting so strange? Was that why I had been changing? When I got back to the RV, my mom was waiting for me with tears in her eyes. She'd found more documents hidden in the box from the ruins. Documents that confirmed everything Edwin had told me. My dad's grandmother hadn't just disappeared during a spring tide. She'd been taken, and now it seemed like history was repeating itself. The next day, Officer Wilson came by again to check on us. He looked tired and worried as he told us about more disappearances along the coastline, locals who had vanished without a trace during the night. I think you should leave, he said firmly. This place isn't safe. But before we could respond, Dad walked out of the RV and stared at Officer Wilson with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between anger and hunger. It sent a chill down my spine. That night was worse than any of the others before it. The singing was louder now, echoing through my head even when I covered my ears. My dad disappeared for hours and came back soaking wet with no explanation of where he'd been or what he'd been doing. And then there was me. The scales behind my ears had spread further down my neck, and the webbing between my fingers was getting thicker. When I looked at myself in the mirror, I barely recognized my own reflection. I'm scared, I whispered to my mom as we huddled together in the RV while another storm raged outside. We'll figure this out, she said, holding me tightly. But her voice wavered like she wasn't sure if she believed her own words. The next morning brought another low tide, the lowest one yet, and for a brief moment we saw it, an enormous underwater city rising out of the waves in the distance. Its spires glistened in the sunlight like they were made of some kind of living coral. That's where they live, Dr. Palmer said when we went to see him later that day. What do they want? I asked. They want their bloodlines back, he replied grimly. They want you. The spring tide was coming, Dr. Palmer said it would be the highest one in a century, and when it arrived, the deep ones would make their move. I didn't know what that meant exactly, but I could feel it in my bones. Something terrible was about to happen. That night, the air felt electric, like the storm wasn't just in the sky but inside us too. The ocean roared louder than ever, and the singing, it was everywhere now. It wasn't just in my head anymore. My mom could hear it too. They're coming, she whispered, clutching my hand as we sat in the RV. We need to leave. But when we tried to start the RV, it wouldn't budge. My dad had sabotaged it, cut wires, drained fuel, something. I didn't know how, but I knew he didn't want us to leave. He was outside, standing at the edge of the cliff with his arms outstretched like he was welcoming something. When we called out to him, he turned to face us, and I gasped. His skin was covered in scales now, shimmering faintly under the moonlight. His eyes glowed with an eerie phosphorescence, and his voice sounded strange when he spoke, deeper, almost like it was coming from underwater. This is where we belong, he said calmly. You'll see soon enough. No, my mom shouted. You're not taking her. He tilted his head slightly, like he pitied her for not understanding. It's not up to me, he said. It's in her blood. Before we could say anything else, figures began emerging from the water, dozens of them. They moved slowly but deliberately, their webbed hands glistening and their glowing eyes fixed on us. The deep ones had arrived. Dr. Palmer showed up just then, carrying an old book and a bundle of strange objects, candles, stones carved with symbols, and what looked like a piece of coral shaped into a dagger. I can hold them off, he said breathlessly, but you need to get to the lighthouse. What's in the lighthouse? I asked as we hurried toward it. There's a device there, he explained. It disrupts their telepathic control. It's the only way to stop them from taking you. As we climbed the rocky path to the lighthouse, my dad followed us, his movements jerky and unnatural now. You don't understand, he shouted after us. This is who we are. This is where we belong. When we reached the lighthouse, Edwin Porter was waiting for us at the door. He looked tired but determined as he motioned for us to come inside. "I've been trying to protect this place for years," he said as he led us up the spiral staircase to the top of the tower. "But tonight might be the end." The device Edwin had mentioned was a strange contraption made of metal and glass that hummed faintly when he turned it on. He explained that it sent out a frequency that disrupted the Deep One's telepathic connection, but only for a short time. "We have one chance," he said grimly. Down below, the Deep Ones were closing in on the lighthouse, their glowing eyes cutting through the darkness like tiny lanterns. My dad was with them now, fully transformed, and when I saw him among them, something inside me broke. "He's gone," my mom whispered, tears streaming down her face. Dr. Palmer began chanting something in a language I didn't understand while Edwin adjusted the device's settings. The humming grew louder until it felt like it was vibrating through my entire body. And then, chaos. The Deep Ones screamed, a horrible sound that made my ears ring as they clutched their heads and staggered back toward the water. Even my dad fell to his knees, his glowing eyes dimming slightly as if whatever force had been controlling him was weakening. But it wasn't enough. One of them lunged at Edwin just as he activated the device fully, dragging him down into the water before we could stop it. Dr. Palmer tried to finish his ritual, but was pulled under moments later by two more of them. "Go," my mom shouted as she grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the stairs. As we ran down from the lighthouse and back toward what was left of our RV, I felt something pulling at me, not physically but mentally, like a voice whispering in my head, "Come home." For a moment, I almost stopped. I almost turned back, but my mom's grip on my arm kept me grounded. The spring tide reached its peak just as we reached the RV. The cliff edge crumbled behind us as waves crashed against it with incredible force, swallowing everything in their path, including whatever remained of my dad and those creatures. We drove away in silence once Edwin's device had done its job and disrupted their control long enough for us to escape.